Starfield's timeline makes no sense. My whole problem with the timeline is that humans have been living in space for hundreds of years by the time the game itself begins, yet they've done so little of note in all this time. Take a look at the timeline presented here and you'll notice that most of the years only have a single bullet point showing that something happened. And it's not like every year is listed here, these are just the years where anything of note occurred and we have a time for it, and it doesn't take much to be a point of note. The defunding of a xenobiology program and Vasco turning on, both are points listed here. It's not like this timeline only counts on monuments of true historical significance. The world of Starfield is one that is supposed to be set 3 centuries ahead of the present. It's apparently the 24th century, but so little has happened in all this time. I was going to point out all the things that have happened in the real world in the past 300 years, but there's just so much that I can't even begin to scratch the surface. I've been trying to write an example into this script for hours, but every single one can't explain the enormity of what humanity is capable of in such a period of time. But in Bethesda's vision of a future, humanity has taken a strange path, one of brief sudden innovation, followed by extended dormant complacency. To understand where I'm coming from, I want to quickly go over the founding of cities in space, which is one of the few major events that take place in this timeline. The first proper settlement built outside of Earth is Cydonia, which is founded on Mars in 2112. New Atlantis is founded 44 years later, in 2156. Then just 11 years later, Akila City is founded. It makes sense that the duration is getting shorter, what with space travel becoming somewhat more of a known thing and the technology advancing. That's all pretty logical to me. But then it's 20 years until the final city is founded. The city of Narion was already a fishing platform for some amount of time, but in 2187 it becomes the final big city of Starfield. And for the next 143 years, no major metropolitan locations seem to be established and maintained. The events of the game take place in 2330, meaning that over 200 years have passed since humans started settling the stars, and yet in those 2 centuries, only a handful of cities were constructed. About 1,000 planets have been discovered, with dozens of them being immediately habitable, and yet humanity for some reason decided to only really make 4 proper cities. We get some smaller scale settlements such as Paradiso and New Homestead, but even these are few and far between. With how few locations there are, it makes it feel like there's barely any people. I asked about this on the channel and got a whole range of guesses for how many people are left. My sister proposed a theory that everyone's just playing a giant game of hide and seek, and running away on their ships every time a player character gets close. Either way, the entire universe feels empty in a way that doesn't make sense to me. The only real justification of sorts I can see for the lack of development comes in the form of the one thing which never changes: war. There's a trio of wars which take place in Starfield's timeline, so before I can get to fixing things, we need to establish what those are. First up is the Narion War. This was the initial conflict between the United Colonies and Freestar Collective, started by the UC putting a medical space station in orbit above one of the system's planets. The people living in the Narion system got real scared of a hospital showing up, so called in the Freestar Collective, who sent their fleet there. Then the UC did the same, then they both decided to fight. It's a very dumb war, one that lasts 20 years, from 2196 to 2216. For the next war of sorts, we have to wait 24 years. In 2240, the Serpent's Crusade begins, which is House Varun attempting to slaughter everyone else. They do this for 23 years, until their leader dies and then his son calls for peace. The final conflict is a big one, the Colony War. This is a giant war between the Freestar Collective and the United Colonies, started when the Collective broke the treaty that was made to end the Narion War. Diplomacy was attempted, but failed, and then the war went on for the next 3 years. Despite this being the war the game focuses the most on, it's also incredibly short. The others were a couple of decades. This one, on the other hand, was just from 2308 to 2311. As far as wars go, that's a pretty brief one. So what we have are these 3 wars taking place at these times. The game then takes place in 2330, 19 years after the final of those events. The argument that could be made for the lack of development throughout the stars is that the wars resulted in a fair amount of destruction. While we do see some of this presented in-game, it's few and far between. And more importantly, all this happened quite some time ago. It's 115 years between the start of the first war and the end of the last one. Only 46 of those years had war taking place during them, meaning that well over half the time was peace, and then there's the added 19 years of peace thereafter. All in all, it's just 20% of the time that humans have been living in space that they've been at war. This is a pretty peace-filled existence according to the timeline. which kind of negates any strong argument that civilization hasn't been built up because of war and destruction. That's a logic which works well in the world of Fallout, where there's constantly fighting taking place and factions vying for violent dominance. But in the world of Starfield, that just doesn't quite hold up. Even factoring in spacers and pirates is just not on a wide enough scale to justify the overall lack of civilization we see in the stars. So it's now time for me to change the timeline. If we want any of this to make sense, we need to first change up when things happened, and then alter how they took place. I'm going to put Bethesda's timeline on the left hand side of the screen, and then my own modified one on the right hand side. First thing you'll notice is that mine starts much later. Everything takes so long to happen in Bethesda's version of events, and I wanted to change that to make things feel at least a little bit more realistic. In my version of events, humanity would have only started colonising the stars about 100 years before the game starts. This immediately halves the time frame we're working in. After that, I'm making it so that a new city is being founded every decade. Honestly, that's still a reasonably slow advance, but shows that the human race is doing what they can to settle the stars. I also decided to kick off the Narion War before Neon gets founded. The way this war ends in the lore always seems a bit odd to me. The United Colonies definitively won, yet the Freestar Collective seemed to come out on top, with them ending up in control of the Narion system. The whole explanation is just that UC citizens were angry that the war had gone on so long, and decided to say that things needed to end peacefully, right after the entire Freestar fleet was destroyed. Bit late to make that demand, UC citizens. Everyone fighting on the opposing side is already dead. Should have either grown a conscience about it earlier and actually saved some lives, or claim victory at the final hurdle. The way I want to alter this is by making it so that United Colonies are still winning the war, but after 16 years, Neon is founded as a proper city. The sale of Aurora suddenly gives a huge influx of cash to the Freestar Collective. This starts to tip things back a little more in their favour, as they can now hire mercenaries and the like to do the fighting for them. After several more months, it becomes clear that fighting the war would be a major drain on resources for the UC, and it may well be better to have the Collective as a trading partner, what with their newfound wealth. We then get back to peace times, during which we can have Earth become uninhabitable, and make it so everyone who left is now having to live on new planets. A year after this catastrophe, we can have the Serpent's Crusade begin. In my version, it's going to last a couple of years longer, and be way more devastating. In the game itself, it's stated that thousands die during this, but thousands dying in a multi-decade war is nothing. Hell, the player character probably ends up with 1,000 kills to their name in a single playthrough, no problem. Instead, the Crusade is going to leave millions upon millions dead. I want this to be a full-on slaughter, where the majority of those who fled to space will lose their lives. And I don't just want it to be the case that soldiers died in battle, but that the Zealots were slaughtering any settlements they could reach. Starfield lacks many small settlements which would be logical to see in the game, but if people fled smaller settlements and sought strength in numbers, then it suddenly makes a bit more sense why we don't see lots and lots of settlements dotted throughout the stars. My version of the Crusade ends just over 3 decades before the beginning of the game, meaning that the older folks in-game would have lived through it, and may well have a fear of smaller settlements and not desire to build them, and the younger people may have been raised with this fear as a lesson taught to them by their parents. Establish all this within the lore of the game, and suddenly the lack of settlements throughout the galaxy makes a lot more sense. And to explain why there's not more giant cities for people to reside in, we'll need to move on to the Colony War. I've converted this into a decade-long war between the Freestar Collective and United Colonies. This would start out just over a decade after the Serpent's Crusade has ended, and would bring even more focused destruction to the planets. I'd want it to be that additional planets were being inhabited, and cities being constructed on them during the past 10 years, but during this war both sides would level all that was built. I'm talking mass destruction, extinction level events, and both sides doing a whole bunch of war crimes. There's already themes of this taking place within the game, with mechanised and xeno warfare, but I want to crank the dial to 11. Have cities levelled by bombing runs, planets rendered uninhabitable by chemical weaponry, and have humanity itself almost wiped out by the combined horrors of this war and the spread of terramorphs throughout the settled systems. Make it so the armistice was something that had to be implemented in order to avert the complete annihilation of the human race. Make it such a horrible war that it makes sense humanity hasn't had a chance to spread any further in the years after. I'd have the game begin almost a decade after the end of the war, with the ramifications of it still being felt by all. Everyone you run across would have been personally affected by this, and still have it fresh in their memory. With the timeline altered this way, it suddenly makes sense that there aren't more established locations. There hasn't been the time to recover. The oldest people you encounter will have lived through 2 different wars and a zealous crusade, each of which prevented the human race from travelling further into space. Not only would this make it so that the lack of additional cities is fairly easy to understand, but it would also allow for deeper regions of space to have no people living there. Being an explorer in Constellation currently doesn't feel all that incredible. You're meant to be exploring new worlds and charting them, but every time you go to a distant planet, it's already been settled by some random people, due to the stupid procedural system that was put in place. Instead, it could have been made so the further you travel, the less of these things pop up. Sure, the systems which have already been settled will have them, and there could be the odd one on the adjacent regions, but eventually you should reach a point where you're actually exploring places never before seen by others. I think it's clear that I have more ideas for what I want changed, but I'm going to have to stop myself before going too much further. Even just with the changes I've made here to the timeline, you would suddenly have a game which takes place in a world that makes a lot more sense. Humanity has no longer conquered the stars, but instead had only just begun their journey through space, when their own greed and zealotry took over, nearly ending the path of the human race for good. Let me know what you thought of the changes, and if you'd like to see more like this. I already did one rewrite video where I changed the Reunion's quest in Fallout 4, so if you actually had a choice on what to do, and to this day it's one of my favourite videos I've ever made. I'd like to turn this into a proper series, so if you've got suggestions or ideas for future episodes, let me know. As always, thanks for watching. Sarge out.